Welcome to the Deep Dive. So today we're tackling something pretty fundamental. How does science actually change? I mean, most of us probably picture, scientists in the lab making discoveries, like a straight line towards progress.
Right. Well, we might have to shake up that picture a little bit today.
Okay.
Yeah, we are diving into Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. It's a book that kind of turned the philosophy of science upside down.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Scientific revolutions sounds a little dramatic, though, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's more accurate than you might think. Kuhn argued that the way we understand science, its history, even the very facts that we rely on, are all shaped by these things he called paradigms.
Paradigms. Okay. I've heard that word, but I don't know if I could actually explain it. Is it
Okay.
just like a fancy word for a theory?
It's much bigger than that.
Okay.
Think of it this way, like a scientist has a mental toolbox, right?
Okay.
Their paradigm is the entire toolbox. It dictates which tools they use, the problems they even consider, and even how they see those problems in the first place.
So it's like everyone in a scientific field is wearing the same pair of glasses. Like they're all looking at the same world, but they're seeing it through a specific lens.
That's a great way to put it. And Kuhn argued that most of the time, scientists are working within that paradigm. They're not trying to shatter those glasses. He calls this normal science.
Okay, normal science. So it's less about those like eureka moments we see in movies and more about just like the everyday work of science.
Exactly. Like a great example of this is the search for the Higgs boson. Physicists spent decades, vast resources just to confirm it exists. It was a particle predicted by the standard model. They weren't trying to overturn the standard model. They were trying to solidify it.
Okay, so if most science is happening within these paradigms, how do they ever change? Is it just kind of a gradual evolution of ideas?
Not necessarily. Kuhn argues that change happens in these dramatic bursts. Those are the scientific revolutions we were talking about. And the key to understanding them is understanding how these paradigms actually work.
Okay, I'm ready for my paradigm shift. Where do we start?
So Kuhn argued that paradigms aren't just about, rules, they're about shared examples. Think about how you learn something new. Like you don't just memorize a list of definitions, right?
Right.
You see how those concepts actually work in different situations.
Like when you learn a new recipe, it's not just reading the ingredients, it's watching someone make it, right? Seeing how they handle the dough or adjust the seasonings.
That's a perfect analogy. Learning science is similar, right? It's about seeing the patterns, recognizing what Kuhn called the family resemblances between different problems, even if they seem totally different on the surface.
That's really interesting. But if everyone's working within this shared paradigm, seeing the world through the same lens, how do those glasses ever even get questioned, let alone, shattered?
Well, that is where things get really interesting. Kuhn argued that these revolutions are often triggered by what he called anomalies. Think of them as those unexpected results or observations that just don't fit neatly into the current paradigm. It's like when you're doing a jigsaw puzzle and you find a piece that doesn't belong anywhere, and it makes you question if you even have the right puzzle.
Exactly.
Okay.
But it is important to note that Kuhn had a different perspective on these anomalies than, say, Karl Popper.
Right, okay.
Popper believed that even a single contradictory observation could, disprove a theory. He really emphasized falsification.
Okay.
But Kuhn didn't think it was that simple. He argued that scientists don't just abandon a paradigm at the first sign of trouble.
Right.
They try to explain away these anomalies to make them fit within the existing framework. I mean, think about it. If you've been working within a certain paradigm for years, you don't just throw it all away because of one contradiction.
Right. It's more like you're trying to force that puzzle piece to fit, even if you have to, bend it a little bit.
In a way, yeah.
But eventually, sometimes those anomalies start piling up, and they just can't be ignored. And that's when the foundation of that paradigm begins to crack. That's when things get interesting. When those anomalies pile up, they can trigger what Kuhn called a scientific revolution. It's a complete paradigm shift, changing how scientists see the world.
Okay, now we're talking. Give me an example, like a big one, something that really changed everything.
Well, you can't talk about paradigm shifts without mentioning the Copernican revolution.
Right.
For centuries, the accepted model of the universe was Ptolemy's geocentric view. Earth at the center, everything revolving around US.
Wait, so before Copernicus, people literally thought the Earth was the center of the universe. That seems, I don't know, a little egotistical.
Well, it made sense at the time, given the observations they had and the philosophical ideas. But as astronomers got more data, they started to notice these discrepancies that Ptolemy's model just couldn't explain.
So those discrepancies were like the misfit puzzle pieces,
Hmm.
the anomalies that made people question the whole picture.
Exactly. And then Copernicus comes along, proposing this radical alternative, a heliocentric model, sun at the center. And it wasn't just a new theory, it was a completely different way of understanding our place in the cosmos.
That's a huge shift for people to like wrap their heads around, talk about challenging assumptions.
It was. And what's really interesting is that these revolutions often redefine what even counts as a scientific question.
Okay.
Think about Newtonian physics and the idea of action at a distance.
Okay, break that down for me. Action at a distance. Sounds kind of spooky.
Basically, it means objects can influence each other without, directly touching.
Gravity, right?
Right. The Earth pulls on the moon, but they're not physically connected. This idea was controversial at first because it challenged the assumptions about how forces work.
So something that we take for granted today, like gravity acting over huge distances, was once a revolutionary idea that shook up the scientific community.
Absolutely. And once it was accepted, it opened up all these new avenues of research.
So it's not just about swapping out one theory for a slightly better one. It's about changing the whole playing field of science, the questions they're asking, and the types of explanations they're even looking for.
Yeah, that's a key takeaway. But here's where things get even more interesting. Kuhn argued that these revolutions, despite their significance, are often invisible in how we learn about science.
Invisible. How can something that big be invisible?
Think about how science is often presented, in textbooks. It's this neat, linear progression, discoveries building on each other. It's a very clean and straightforward story of progress.
Yeah, like those history books that make everything seem inevitable.
Yeah.
But in reality, there were probably a lot of dead ends and debates and overturned ideas along the way.
Exactly. And Kuhn pointed out that this kind of sanitized view of science hides the messy revolutionary process that actually drives it forward.
So it's like the textbooks are airbrush photos, right?
Yeah.
You get this polished version of reality, but you're missing all the interesting details and the struggles that actually shaped things.
Perfect analogy. And this tendency to smooth over history, you see it in how we attribute discoveries. Take the idea of a chemical element. Most textbooks credit Robert Boyle with this idea.
Right, he defined elements as those basic substances that can't be broken down further.
Exactly. But they often forget to mention that this concept of an element evolved over time, shaped by the work of many scientists before Boyle.
So the textbook gives you this convenient hero, but it's simplifying a much more complex process.
Exactly. And this brings us to one of Kuhn's most mind-bending ideas. He argued that scientists working under different paradigms actually experience the world differently.
Hold on, so it's not just how they interpret data, but what they actually perceive.
Exactly. He believed that the world itself, at least for the scientist, actually changes with their paradigm.
Okay, that's a wild concept. Are you saying that scientists wearing those different paradigm glasses wouldn't even see the same things?
He pointed to this fascinating psychology experiment to kind of illustrate this point. They showed people these playing cards, but some were anomalous, right? A red six of spades.
Okay.
Initially, a lot of the subjects just couldn't be the anomaly. They perceived them as normal cards, their minds trying to make the data fit what they expected.
Wow. So their existing beliefs actually shaped what they saw. How does that work in real science, though?
Take the discovery of Uranus.
Okay.
William Herschel initially thought he'd found a comet or a star. It was only when they saw discrepancies in its movement, those anomalies, that a shift in perception occurred. And then Uranus was recognized as a planet.
So a celestial body that's been there all along is suddenly seen differently just because of a change in perspective.
Yeah.
It's one of those optical illusions where you can see two different images depending on how you look at it.
Exactly. And that shift in perspective, it had ripple effects. Astronomers started looking for other planets. They found all these asteroids. The world, at least for astronomy, expanded.
It's not just about changing a theory. It's about fundamentally changing how you see the world, what you consider possible. It makes me wonder, how do scientists working under these different paradigms even communicate with each other?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it leads us to another of Kuhn's key concepts, incommensurability. He argued that communication across paradigms can be incredibly difficult because scientists are basically operating within different conceptual universes.
So even if they're using the same words, those words have different meanings, like different connections to their understanding of the world.
Exactly. Imagine trying to explain baseball to someone who only knows cricket.
Okay.
Some of the words might be similar, but the whole game's played on a different field with different rules and a different objective.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. So how do these scientific revolutions even happen if people can barely talk to each other across paradigms? Does one side just win the argument?
Kuhn argued that it's not that simple. He said these transitions aren't driven just by logic or even evidence. He described it more as like a conversion experience, a sudden shift where you see the world in a new light.
So it's not about being convinced, it's about a fundamental change in your whole worldview, almost like a religious experience.
That's a surprisingly apt comparison. And this idea of incommensurability, it raises these profound questions about scientific progress. If these paradigms are so radically different, can we even say that one is better than another? Or is scientific progress just like a myth?
So if these scientific revolutions are more like these conversion experiences than logical debates, how do we even measure scientific progress?
Yeah.
Is it even real, or are we just kind of trading one set of glasses for another?
That's the big question, isn't it? Kuhn argued that science does progress, but it's not the kind of progress we usually imagine. It's not a straight line to the truth. It's more like a series of shifts, sometimes dramatic, sometimes subtle. And they let us solve more puzzles and understand the world in new ways.
But if those puzzles, like even the definition of understanding, are shaped by the paradigm, how can we compare progress across those different paradigms? It's like saying apples are better than oranges. They're just different.
That's a great point. And Kuhn wrestled with that, He suggested that we can see progress within a paradigm. Like, scientists get better at solving those puzzles, making predictions, refining their tools. But comparing across paradigms, that's trickier.
So it's like a master chess player is obviously skilled, but you can't really compare them to a Go mastery. They're playing totally different games.
Exactly. Kuhn argued that judging progress across paradigms involves looking at, problem solving, accuracy of predictions, even the scope of what the paradigm can explain. But he admitted those comparisons are always going to be a little subjective based on the values of the time.
So scientific progress isn't this absolute thing. It's more of a judgment call based on what we value at the time.
Yeah, it definitely complicates things.
Yeah.
But Kuhn didn't think that meant progress was an illusion. He just argued that we need to be more careful how we think about it. And he also pointed out that science seems to progress in a way that other fields, like art or philosophy, don't.
Yeah, now that you mention it, we don't talk about progress in art the same way we do in science. What did Kuhn think was different?
Well, he thought it had to do with the structure of the scientific community and how it approaches knowledge. Scientists, unlike artists or philosophers, are trained within a very specific paradigm, exposed to a pretty narrow range of perspectives.
So going back to those paradigm glasses, scientists are basically given a very specific prescription from the start.
Exactly. And that's different from fields like, say, history or philosophy, where students are encouraged to explore different viewpoints from the beginning. Kuhn argued that this difference in training, it's part of what makes science so cohesive. They can make progress quickly within a given paradigm.
But doesn't that also make them, more resistant to those paradigm shifts, those revolutions?
That's the trade-off. The same thing that allows for quick progress within a paradigm can also make it harder to break free when it's no longer working.
So it's this constant tension between the comfort of that normal science and the disruptive potential of those revolutions. Makes you wonder if we're missing revolutionary ideas just because they don't fit our current way of thinking.
It's definitely something to think about, and I think that's one of Kuhn's biggest contributions, challenging us to really examine our own beliefs and assumptions, not just in science, but in everything.
This has been a really eye-opening deep dive.
Yeah.
Science is not just about facts and discoveries. It's about the frameworks we use to understand those facts and how those frameworks can shift in pretty revolutionary ways.
Well said. Kuhn's work reminds us that even the most well-established ideas can be overturned. Progress isn't always linear. And questioning your assumptions is essential for understanding.
I've got a lot to think about after this conversation. I think I need to read Kuhn's book for myself now to really digest all of this.
I highly recommend it. It's challenging, but really rewarding. It's a book that's still sparking debate today, even all these years later.
Well, if you enjoy this deep dive into Thomas Kuhn's ideas, be sure to check out his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. You can find a link to buy it in the show notes. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the deep dive for more fascinating conversations. Thanks for joining us.